the so-called Eurasian thinkers, and who are a little bit more scary. So they were, kind of coming up with the so-called Russian idea. What is Russia? I remember, for example, when in 2004, when I went to Russia to a conference on Sergei Bulgakov. And what I found interesting, because I was interested in the more abstruse Bulgakov, his understanding of Trinitarian theology, Christology, but all the Russian speakers were interested in his writings about Russia. And so this was really what was animating things. And into this situation, you have the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been greatly persecuted, as people know, during the Soviet period. And a lot of this revival was driven by big figures now who, in particular, Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And he had been somebody who had a background in all of these different thinkers. And he was very interested also in a lot of sort of clash of civilizations type talk. He was interested in some writings from the sort of Republican, even into the far right, talking about family values. And he was also wanting a situation where the Russian Orthodox Church would play a central role in to uphold, in a way, the Russian Federation, to provide a sort of cultural and religious nexus to allow it Russia to become a stronger kind of power. And so as you're in the waning days of the then patriarch, who sort of overlaps with the end of communism into the beginning of the post-1991 figure, this is Patriarch Alexei. In 2009, Kirill is elected, but before then, he held a very, very strong role in the Russian church as the head of the Department for External Church Relations, which had been created during the Soviet period, is almost like the sort of Politburo. It had its own seminary. It was a massive and very powerful department, and Kirill had been a figure who had been powerful, possibly with KGB links, dating back to the 1960s. He was one of the major movers and shakers for the Russian Church, for the World Council of Churches. And Kirill started to try to take up this nascent kind of idea of the Russian world, and he, in a way, offered it to the government, which got very interesting in as a sort of an official ideology. So the Russian world argues that there is a transnational sphere or civilization, which is Russian, and it includes Russian, Ukraine, and Belarus, but often they will throw in multiple other countries, particularly Moldova, which has appeared in the news recently. And watch that, because it's not an accident. It could be a false flag thing that they're doing to, as it were, take that territory. But it also includes wherever there are Russian speakers. So the Baltic areas, the Baltic countries, which were a part of the former Soviet Union, and even Finland. And in this Russian world, there is a common political center, which is Moscow, a common language, which is Russian. So you'll often hear, even from your average Russians, where they'll say Ukrainian is not really its own language. It is just a version of Russian. This is quite common. So a common language, a common political center, a common spiritual center, yeah. Kiev, the mother of all Rus. And this terminology of the mother of all Rus is coming from what they call the primary chronicle, which is a text that probably dates from about the 11th century and details Saint Prince Vladimir and all these kind of legendary kind of figures. And so it's a common spiritual center, Kiev, hence the interest in Kiev. There is a common church with a common patriarch, which of course is the Moscow Patriarchate. So there's divisions over the church in Ukraine. This is leading up to this war. And this common patriarch works in symphonia. So this is a sort of political a vision built out of the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea and other figures, which has developed into, well, during the 19th century, into a sort of Orthodox, often for conservatives, political vision of church and state. And he works with, of course, the great leader, who is Putin. And then there are common moral values, art, vision. Even I've seen in writings where it was proposed in some writings coming out of the Russian church that there should be a common financial system. So I'm not inventing any of this. It was done in massive detail by church actors as well as state actors. And the argument this was so important that indeed in 2007, Putin established the Ruski Mir Fund, the Ruski Mir sort of charity or foundation, which is a sort of, if I'm to be blunt, a sort of fascist kind of British council, which opened up centers, including, I think, even now till this day, perhaps they've shut down in Edinburgh, and they would offer things, rather benign things, like language or poetry readings. I remember in Oxford they would do this when I was there, through St. Anthony's College, if I remember correctly. But they would also put forth the ideology which I've given to you. Now, in this ideology, you also have this idea that is very often stood, that there is a corrupt West that stands against this Russian civilization, which is the sort of, as is argued in many of these writings, the last bastion, as it were, of a Christian vision of the world. So they'll talk about radical secularization. There's a lot of the writings of, for example, of somebody called Hilarion Alfeyev have been against this. Beginning 2006 and forward, he writes endlessly about this. And then also Christianophobia, and they in particular have been obsessed, and I think that's a correct word to use, with everything to do with the LGBTQ plus kind of reality. So some of you may have heard that Kirill was going on about gay parades in the Donbass, and this was one of the reasons why they needed to have the special military operation. So this is the ideology. Now, it is this ideology, this isn't me just inventing this, it is very clearly stated in the writings of Putin, if you actually bother to look at them. So on the 21st of February, so shortly before the war, when Putin's giving his sort of long, what people described as a long and rambling speech that was totally confused. It wasn't to me. It just is confusing because secular people don't know how to understand religion and history. And he says, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Since time immemorial, he says, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. And so this is his justification, in a way, for the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. And then further, in his July 2021 essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he writes, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory were bound together by one language, economic ties, the rule of the princes of Rurik dynasty, and the baptism of Rus. And then he says, in rather chilling words, he's talking about the danger of Ukrainians having a separate identity from Russia. He says, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the path of forced assimilation, the formation of an ethnically pure Ukrainian state, aggressive towards Russia, is comparable in its consequences to the use of weapons of mass destruction against us. So you understand now that for him, and what is going on with the development of a separate identity, a sense of Ukrainian nationhood, is like a nuclear weapon, is fighting
Yeah.
words.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could if I could ask something about the statement itself, so the declaration on the Russian world teaching, because it seems you've given a really clear account and made a really powerful case for the the significance of this ideology and these church teachings, specifically in the background of the invasion. But so what about the other side? You and a group of an international group of Orthodox theologians decided to make this declaration. What's the motivating force for that? What did you hope to achieve? What's the audience?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was multiple, I would say. First of all, I think as Orthodox theologians, we wanted to make absolutely clear that what was being stated by Kirill, once the media actually started to pay attention, because at first they weren't, that this was not Orthodox Christianity, that this was a distortion. And if I was to use, and it's only used once in the actual document, it is a heresy in the sense of being a fundamental distortion or transmogrification of a particular reality. So we wanted to distinguish it from Orthodox Christianity. We wanted to do that not only because this Russian world teaching, which I've been writing about, and many of the authors have been writing about for the last 10, 15 years, is that this is, as it were, a perpetual danger to not only Russian Christianity, but to many forms of Orthodox Christianity. Sadly, sad to say, that they also are in danger of ethnophilitism, of a type of tribalistic kind of sacralization of nation, state, and everything to do with that. A type of Blut und Boden, a type of blood and soil approach to religion. And then we also knew that this was this ideology, and the Russian church more broadly, was very attractive to those outside of Russia. So many people on the Protestant far right have been, for the last decade, making connections for the World Organization for the Families. It's got some sort of kind of term like this. And here I would point everyone to the writings and the research of Christina Stuckel of Innsbruck in Austria. And she has a text coming out on the the Christian International. It's got a title like that. And so there is a lot of far right people and Christian nationalists who Protestants, but also you find it with a lot of sympathy, I'm sad to say, in some parts of the Vatican. So there has been, for the last 20 years, a sort of cozy relationship between the Moscow Patriarchate and various people in the high up in the Catholic Church. They felt, I think, on the side of the Catholic Church, that they had a similar, a kind of common agenda of family values, of common moral values, and there was a lot of this fear of secularization, a fear of kind of marginalization of Christian voices. So we wanted to state and to make it very, very clear that none of these things were a danger, and that they weren't fundamentally a part of the Christian message. And I sometimes like to say that I am a sort of an Orthodox Bartian. I started my sort of work in theology. I've now kind of gone more into religious studies, but I started it, studying Bart, and I still teach Bart, and so I knew about the Barmen Declaration.
Right. Yeah. No. So this was one of the things that I was going to ask about, because for one of the things that particularly attracted me to the Declaration, as somebody who's done a lot of work on German Protestant theology of the 1930s, was that the very clear parallels to what some folk here will be familiar with, others may not. The Barmen Declaration as a really key document in a key anti-Nazi Protestant Christian document
Yeah.
of the mid-1930s, which made within the German churches as a touchstone for the church struggle, right, for the split between
Well, that was
the anti-Nazi
very
church and the
conscious, Rachel. I
yeah.
mean, I literally I read once again the Barmen Declaration. So when this was proposed to me by my Greek colleagues, I went away. I sort of downloaded and marked up the Barmen Declaration. And I was, obviously it's not an exact parallel, because we're not figures in Russia, but I
Yeah.
wanted to. I thought it was a useful instrument to be able to bring across the importance of this moment. So I used the structure of the Barmen Declaration, which is to say that you would have scripture, because I wanted to insist upon the centrality of scripture and the witness to the scripture as we Orthodox understand it within tradition, as the very basis, not looking to use the language of Barmen, other lords, as is the basis of revelation and the foundation of any approach, but looking to scripture. So we have this, since I'm a scholar of Bulgakov, kind of antinoming, so he has this idea of antinomianism, and so you have a negative to a positive thing, scripture, and then we say, we affirm. You have an
Affirm this
affirmation,
yeah.
and then there is a negation. And so I borrowed this from it. And in some cases, I'm to be entirely honest, I actually literally cut and paste Barmen in there and then rewrote it. Now that's the first level. What I then did is I also read at the same time something called the Synodicon, which most of your listeners probably will have no idea what this is. So this is a key text in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and it is traditionally, it's a sort of liturgical text which is intoned on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, which is the beginning of sort of Lent, and it originally came out to affirm the orthodoxy of the icons, but also it over time it accumulated, it sort of, as it were, negated not only iconoclasm but all number of different heresies. Now I'm not the biggest fan. I'm the sort of person who in general is sort of doesn't use the word heresy, and I've never liked the Synodicon, but I think that there are moments in history when you do need, when things are in danger and you need to, as it were, state it. So I took many parts of the Synodicon and rewrote them. So the Barmen, maybe, Western readers get that, but the Orthodox readers will get the other resonances, not only the liturgy, but also, and they're not, we don't always let people know, the echoes of the Synodicon. Now, the Synodicon, what happens is they'll mention a particular heresy, and then and it's usually done by some particular deacon. They go anathema, 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 and so when in the early stages of the document, we actually used the language of anathema,
right.
but we did not anathemize people. but particular teachings. But after a discussion amongst all the different theologians, we decided that really we didn't feel this sort of language, that there was a place for this in the 21st century, and that it would actually take away from the power and in a way would be a stumbling block. So we came up with the sort of euphemistic, but it essentially means anathema. We therefore condemn as non-orthodox and reject. This was the compromise phrase. Sorry, I'm going on, Rachel, but you please.
No. I mean, so one thing that's really striking me about that is the sense that both the use of Barman and the use of the Synodicon is about, if you like, raising the stakes or making it clear what's at stake. So so the resonance with Barman is saying, well, look, this is a crisis comparable to the crisis of Christian collaboration with or support for Nazism, and the Synodicon is the church crisis, right? This is a crisis comparable to anything you'd want to make anathema, anything you want to call heresy.
I think it's important at moments like this to draw on, as it were, the collective memory and metaphors. So my first degree was in English, and language has power, and so in a way we, well, even within our English language, there are phrases from the Book of Common Prayer which just become a part of our culture, become a part of our language. You won't know that you're using them and their origin. That's their origin. So this was my attempt, as it were, to almost kind of to flick a switch in the consciousness. What has happened is that people got, and particularly German colleagues, who have gotten very kind of, it's almost become a stumbling block for them. And they felt, oh, well, you're saying that you're the same as these people who were under Nazism. And so there was a lot of focus, at least in the initial month or so, from some critics on the fact that this was not written by Russians in Russia. And when we're not claiming that this is, kind of Barman 2.0. And indeed, there were other texts that went into it. But, I think that it's of a similar moment. It's a similar,
it's the scale of the moment. Yes. So, Fred, I'll just make one administrative announcement, which is that if folks have questions that they know they want to pose, please feel free to start putting questions in the chat, and then I can feed those in. I'll ask one more question and then see about opening it up. So, Brandon, you've already said a little bit about responses that you've had, and particularly interested in these critical responses teasing out the issue. But what can you say something about any responses to the declaration that have particularly surprised you? Maybe any responses from friendly critics that have been particularly interesting, or what? Yeah, any comment on how it's been received?
Two in particular. So I have a colleague called Andrei Shishkov who fled. He was working high up in the, he worked for something called the Aspirantura, which was a special thing set up to essentially train high-level clerics by the Moscow Patriarchate. He ended up getting fired from that position, I think largely because he wasn't doing what they wanted in terms of holding their ideology. And he now has, I think he's there with his family in Estonia at the University of Tartu. He's a very gifted theologian. And when it first came out, we had a long correspondence, and he wrote a very powerful critique. He signed, but he had difficulties with, well, in one of the areas that he had difficulties with is he didn't want to use the word heresy. And he had difficulties because he felt that that all nations have their understanding of being special. This is something which you will find with a lot of people in national churches. It's very hard to argue for the type of what I would call pan-orthodoxy, which this document is representative. But he wrote a very powerful critique. So that's the first one I would say.
So that's about this question: how are you making a special case of Russia in a way that's inappropriate? Is that part of the? Yes,
feeling, I think, by some Although I don't think that is in Andre's very good critique, which is also available on Public
Mm,
Orthodox,
mm,
um,
mm,
uh, that it was Russophobic. I think he doesn't make that thing, but he wanted to try to say that heresy is not the right word, and so I'm very open to that. This is it's a text of the moment.
mm,
In this sense, it's not a creed.
mm, mm,
It's written, as it were, as a product of consciousness raising, and these issues are there to discuss, and to expand, and for Orthodox and non-Orthodox and secular people to try to understand what is happening to us and
mm,
understand the role of religion. So
mm,
I was very happy and then the other one, which I'm really was flabbergasted by, and it has appeared last night finally in an English translation, is an appeal to what they call the historic Eastern patriarchs. So these would be Constantinople, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, and Cyprus. So these people who are familiar with church history may know these are very ancient centers, and there are, as it were, churches that are based there. Except for Cyprus, they tend to be extraterritorial churches, which are of similar kind of antiquity to the Church of
to
Rome.
Moscow, yeah. Oh no,
Yeah.
to Rome, yeah.
And so a Moscow Patriarchate priest in Ukraine, a man
Yeah.
called Andrei Pinchuk, a very brave man and quite a strong personality, wrote an appeal to these bishops
Mm,
to canonically try Patriarch Kirill for the heresy of the Russian world,
yes, I saw this.
and to also try him for moral crimes in regard to what he has done. And the and he points to being Orthodox. You have to point to something that happened a long time ago. He points to the precedent of the 1666 trial of Patriarch Nicholas
Brilliant.
of Moscow. Now, for most of the colleagues, they will have no idea what this is, but there is a group. There was a schism
Yeah.
in the that period in the Russian Church, between the so-called old believers and the regular Russian Church over liturgical matters. Some of them very, what we would consider now, ridiculously minor, like
Oh,
whether
you
you
cross yourself. Yeah. Yeah. Two fingers. Yeah.
say "Lord have mercy," this sort
Mm,
of things, and so they called on the Russian church at the time. They brought in, I think it was Antioch, maybe, and Alexandria, and they held a church kind of trial for this patriarch, and eventually he was laicized, he was defrocked and made into a simple monk. So this appeal, which is been signed now by over 400 sort of priests of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, is being sent to these people. Now, I mean, I'm
do you
very.
think that will anything happen? I mean, I've just posted the
I
link to it
mean,
in the chat. Folk can have a look. Yeah.
honestly, I don't think anything will happen, because we have a problem in the Orthodox world with with leadership. We have a bishop problem, quite frankly, and also, so they're not willing to intervene unless it's to cover their kind of territorial posteriors, and secondly, the other reason why nothing will happen and why they probably won't have a meeting is that the Church of Antioch depends upon the Assad family in Syria, and
Yeah.
its survival is
Yeah.
dependent upon, because it's based in Antioch, is
Antioch. Yes.
essentially a cow town outside of Damascus,
Yeah.
and so they won't in any way jeopardize their people,
Fine.
or they would face persecution.
Mm,
And then Jerusalem is a patriarchate which has deep, I'm afraid, shady ties to the Russian Church. One thing that people may have not seen recently is in Jerusalem, I saw this in the Jerusalem Post, that the Russian church is attempting to, is having a fight with an organization over the ownership of some historic property of the Russian church in Old Jerusalem. So,
Mm.
so for
Well,
these,
so this gets caught. This appeal gets caught up in geopolitics at that level
this
as
is
soon as yeah.
important to
Mm,
know. I noticed on Twitter you were saying, looking at the various different statements in Parliament to do with religion, because we have this silliness, this blindness, I think, in some parts of the West. You have the most extreme version of it would be in my native Canada, where people are. I'm almost allergic or phobic to a religion. Here, where you routinely get people thinking that you live in a secular thing, even though Parliament begins with prayers, and you have
mm,
bishops sitting
mm,
in Parliament,
mm,
and I mean, religion is an aspect of geopolitics. Bishops have and always will play a role in the political life of
mm,
their
mm,
countries.
mm, mm,
The sort
yeah,
of notion of laicite in the strictest
yeah.
sense is an illusion.
Yeah. So I've got a few questions coming through in the chat. So I just want to make sure that colleagues get a chance to ask them. I mean, I think we may as well. People could unmute and ask them directly. Simon Hewitt, did you want to ask your question? Because Brandon can't see the chat, so I'm just.
Yeah. So thank you. That was really engaging and fascinating and useful to hear. I was just wondering, as a kind of practical question, what those of us who are members of Catholic or Protestant churches can do in our own churches to stop this doctrine taking hold, stop it having influence in the Western churches. Are you aware of any kind of moves along those lines? Do you have any suggestions for the kind of thing we could do?
Well, I mean, I think for Catholics, I would first of all, there needs to just be education. A lot of the time now, I think it's only now. A friend of mine who was in Munich recently was talking to some Catholic bishops about this. So a lot of them don't know about this. They some sort of and well-meaning Catholics will often see, oh well, Russia, they uphold our Catholic values. They're interested in, broadly speaking, a sort of version of Catholic culture, and they have, I think, some illusions. And so what needs to happen is that people simply point their leaders to the actual bad aspects of this and say, well, here, look at what these Orthodox are actually saying about this. You can, and there's lots of writings about this out there. And in regard to Protestant folk, well, I would say the same thing. To start being critical of attempts towards any form of Christian nationalism,
Right.
which is an absolute, and this is an absolute contradiction to the Christian faith. Christian nationalism. So I think that's what I would recommend, is simply education.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, no, I was thinking. There's also the solidarity declaration, which I don't
Absolutely.
know. Simon and I have both signed, which is
Initial
speaking
signatories.
specifically about Christian nationalism as the sort of strand to one of the many strands in what you've said
Yeah.
that has this wider application. Ben, colleague Ben Wood has a question about Russian ethno-nationalism and paganism. Ben, are you there?
Yes, hello, Brandon. I was thinking while you were talking about Alexander Dugin, who's
Yes.
often thought of as like Putin's kind of ideologue, and
Yes.
I wonder whether you wanted to comment on the kind of strange contradictions with somebody like Dugin, who plays with imagery around the church, but also draws on like neo-pagan ideas of land and people. But there's also kind of an influence from somebody like Julius Evola, and these kind of shades of the occult far right. Have any Orthodox theologians taken on these sources, specifically in order to defeat them? And is there that kind of awareness of that broader kind of occult ideology that underlies some of this stuff?
Well, it could be that there are people writing on this. Perhaps Sarah Riccardi Schwartz, who's written on a lot of far right type stuff. It could be that in the writings of Father Cyril Havarun, that there is, but yeah, I mean, I know about Dugin, and in fact, it was in 2004 in my visit to Russia that I first heard about this person who I up until then didn't know anything about. Dugin, I think is like so much of this. He just sort of hoovers up ideas, and the kind of mixing of the occult with Christianity and drawing on kind of pagan ideas. Well, this was something that you found is there's nothing new about this. You find thinkers who are often brilliant. So, for example, Vladimir Solovyov, the great philosopher who has a lot of Russian messianism in him, was deeply into the occult. So in a way, I guess we shouldn't be surprised about this, because a lot of these ideas are drawing on kind of ideas that you'll find in the late 19th century, in the so-called Silver Age of when all of these people were writing. So even there was a period when Sergei Bulgakov was into the occult as well. So I would have to get back to you in terms of exact things about the Russian occult. I do know that there is an American scholar who is written on, who's an American Slavist, who's Kirsty something or other. But I could send to Rachel, or if you email me, I could give you stuff on the Russian occult. But this is something that I am interested in, but haven't done research myself.
Okay, thank you.
There's some interesting parallels in Nazi religion again, right? Is because there's a lot of debate there obviously about relative influence of Christianity and of paganism in constructing the ideology. But yeah, Adrian's got a question about South Africa. Yeah, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you. Another comparative link. But first and foremost, thank you so much, Brandon, for doing this really important work. And I mean, it's such a wonderful example of the importance and the relevance of, I mean, why we need scholars of religion and theology, right? But yeah, I've recently been supervising an undergraduate student working on the Belhar Confession, which was signed in the 1980s as a protest against apartheid in South Africa. And which was also inspired by the Bar Treason. So it makes sense that these three different declarations kind of follow a similar pattern and style. But one of the things that I realized from the work of my student was the impacts of the Belhar Confession that the Belhar Confession gained thanks to its adoption by the World Council of Church, no, not by the World's Alliance of Reformed Churches. Okay. Then I think it was, and by similar kind of ecumenical bodies. And that's basically my question: how, because your declaration has, as far as I know, mostly been cited or only been cited by individual theologians, right, and not yet by kind of ecumenical bodies. So in terms of strategy, is that on the radar to kind of mobilize support from and weight from ecumenical bodies?
That's an interesting thing. I mean, it has been signed by bishops in about both Anglican bishops, some bishops in some other Protestant churches. It has been signed by, I think, at least maybe one Catholic bishop and multiple Orthodox bishops, but in their sort of private capacity. Now, in terms of ecumenical organizations, no, we haven't thought about that. At the moment, I guess we're at this point where we're trying to simply make it better known. And trying, I suppose, all of us, including myself, are just rather surprised, because I up until now, I was working on my research projects on, various different things, but this was, I didn't set out to do, I guess I'm sort of a public theologian of a sort now, and that's not, this is not something which I set out. I have colleagues who do that, and they do it very well, but it's not. And so that is a very good suggestion. I am in touch with a colleague of mine who works for the World Council of Churches, and I know that he is sort of circulating it. So this could be sort of the next steps. What's happening as well is that it's being published by German academic journals, as well as one of Brill's journals, Mission Studies, is going to be publishing it. So it's kind of a popping up in different places, which may allow a sort of entree to what you're talking about. It is very hard to know what to do, and as the people who did this, it's a sort of ad hoc committee of people led by, I guess it was led by Pantelis Kelitzidis and myself, and we, as it were, don't have any strategy, and we only ever wanted to just sort of raise consciousness about this, but I guess it will depend upon how the war progresses as to what we do. I'm very worried that this is going to spill over into other areas, and to bring in areas like Moldova and possibly, worst case scenario, the Baltic areas. And so if it did that, I think what you're talking about would make a great deal of sense. I then have to ask myself, well, because I spend a lot of my time talking to journalists now and doing this, and I want to do my own writing. And ask yourself, well, at what point do you become an activist, and at what point are you a theologian and or a scholar of religion, writing things for peer-reviewed journals and trying to get my edited volumes out. So this is, I guess, things that I'm asking myself right now. I'm even thinking, well, maybe I got onto Twitter because of all of this thing, and now I'm asking myself, maybe I should just get off of Twitter because it's a distraction.
Because there are other things better, because you have a life to lead, right? Yes.
I went onto this not thinking I was going to be an activist, but you sometimes events seize you and you end up doing what you didn't expect.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I'd say about this centre is that there are a lot of scholars involved here for whom these kinds of pulls between scholarly work and impact work and activism are very much part of how they work. I'm just wondering, we have a few more minutes if there are more questions that folk want to put. Otherwise I might sort of sneak in sneaky ones myself, but I wanted to double check that I wasn't taking time from anyone else. Yeah, I mean, I guess one maybe one sort of question for the end that's in the back of my mind is about responses from within Russia, insofar as you've been able to get any. I mean,
well,
obviously, this is a difficult matter, but
there have been some, how shall we say, kind of attacks. So some of them were on various Telegram channels. So this is a sort of social media thing that's popular in Slavic countries. And then there was a very long, what I might call screed that attacked it from a sort of Moscow Patriarchate kind of context, basically saying it was, the product of NATO and NATO. So some people claim that we were NATO theologians. I found, because I'm no I can tell you, I'm no big fan of American foreign policy either. I mean, I grew up in Canada, which in some ways has its identity in opposition to America. So I've always been deeply suspicious of this. So there were these kind of standard attacks. And then a few more thoughtful pieces that appeared first in Russian and then in English from. But I guess what I'm paying attention to very much is I hear about from my friend Sergei Chapnin, but also through other sources, people who are trying very much to witness within the Russian context.
Yep.
And it's a type of, you would refer to them as confessors. So
Yep.
the early church, you had these people who, at the risk of their lives, would stand up to the imperial pagan authorities. So I'm thinking of there's a deacon. I think this appeared in English, called Dmitry Bayev, who was in Kirov, which is sort of north of Moscow, and he posted on social media some quite anti-war statements, and essentially the security services came into his apartment and searched him, and essentially were kind of, because of these statements that were put on social media, he ended up getting risking to go to prison, so he had to flee from Russia with his family. There was another fellow, Father John
Burden,
who was working with a well-known Father Georgi Eldenstein, I think it is, who was in Kostroma, which is a part of the Golden Ring, and he ended up trying to, I think he put it on his parish website and in a homily, saying that there's nothing Christian about what is happening, and he ended up getting fined a huge amount of money for kind of just a local village priest, something like £200, which is for us doesn't sound a lot, but for him. So these are the sorts of people who I think are there. And gradually, I think what will happen as the bodies either return or not return is people will start questioning. At least this is my hope. Meanwhile, the difficulty is that in all of Russia, you have this absolute control of all sources of information by the state, and it's constant kind of bombardment. And so, I mean, I'm not even sure to what extent they would even have access
to the statement. I mean, that was one of the difficulties that I was aware of, which so the traffic back and forth will be so difficult and intermittent. Brandon, thanks ever so much for your talk. You see, we're getting lots of appreciative comments in the chat. Jonathan, I'm going to apologise that we didn't have time for the question, because we do need to finish. This is a question about the background in Orthodox political theology, which is an important area of interest, and maybe since maybe Brandon could take some time from talking to journalists and would be willing to answer questions if folk wanted to get in touch afterwards. I've got a question there from Natalie, practically about access to the recording. It should appear in the meeting chat, so if you have had access to the meeting chat, you should be able to access the recording. If anybody has trouble accessing the recording later and needs it, I just encourage them to email me directly, and I'll find a way to get you in touch. Friends, if you would feel able to unmute for a bit, just to give an audible round of applause to Brandon, that would be great. Brandon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.